They were not just TV stars, Tony and Mike Beets were legends. If you've ever watched the show Gold Rush, you already know their faces. Tony, with his deep voice, strong build and rough attitude, looked like someone born to fight nature. His son Mike followed in his footsteps, learning everything from his father and becoming just as tough. Together they weren't just a mining team, they were a dynasty. They worked hard in the cold, in the dirt, and sometimes in dangerous places just to find gold. And they didn't just do it quietly. Cameras followed them, millions of people watched them every week. Fans loved their passion, their courage, and their fights with the wild. But what if everything you knew about them was only one side of the story? This is where things get strange. When people think of crime, they don't usually think of miners. They think of thieves, gangsters, or scammers in suits, not a father and son digging in the ground for gold. That's why the news came as such a shock. Suddenly there were whispers, rumors. Something was wrong. Something was happening behind the scenes that viewers never saw on TV. And once the truth started coming out, it spread like wildfire. No one could look at Tony and Mike the same way again. The Beets family had always been different. They weren't like other reality TV stars who smiled for the camera and lived in mansions. They lived far from big cities, in freezing parts of Canada and Alaska, spending most of their time running huge machines and yelling over engines. They didn't care much about fame, they wanted gold. And they found it more than most could dream of. Tony was called the Viking for a reason. He had his own way of doing things. He didn't follow rules unless he had to. And maybe that's where the trouble began. Some people say that power changes people. Maybe that's true. When you have too much success, too much control, you start to think that nothing can touch you, that laws are for others, that you're safe. Maybe that's how Tony and Mike felt. Or maybe they just made a mistake. A big one, something that would cost them everything. At first the details were unclear. There were just headlines. Gold Rush stars under investigation. Most fans thought it was fake news or just something small. But slowly more details came out. There were talks about illegal activities, about things done off camera that no one knew about. Suddenly the same hands that had pulled gold from the dirt were being accused of something far darker. What could they have done that led to such serious charges? That question is what kept people glued to their screens. Not to watch Gold Rush, but to follow the real-life drama now playing out in courtrooms, not gold fields. How could a father and son known for hard work and determination now be at the center of something so serious? Some believed they were innocent. Others said this had been coming for a long time. People started digging into their past, every moment on TV, every argument, every decision. Was there a clue that everyone had missed? And what about their family? Tony's daughter Monica and the rest of the crew, how were they handling this? This wasn't just a legal case. It was a personal disaster. Years of building a name, a brand and a legacy, all of it now hanging by a thread. The Beets weren't just in danger of going to prison, they were at risk of losing everything they had worked for. The gold, the land, the show. The respect. Some said this was just the price of fame, that when you let cameras into your life, the world will eventually find your weak spots. Others said it was something deeper, that the mining world had its own dark secrets and the Beets were just one of the few caught. But no matter the reason, the truth remained the same. Tony and Mike were not seen as heroes anymore, they were seen as suspects, and the story had only just begun. People watched interviews, read every article, and waited for court updates like it was another episode of the show. But this time it wasn't entertainment. It was real. And it was painful. There were no retakes, no scripts, and no happy music in the background. Just a father and son sitting in court, waiting to hear what would happen to them. The silence was louder than the sound of any mining machine. It's strange how quickly things can change. One day you're standing on top of a mountain of gold. The next you're behind bars, wondering how everything fell apart. For Tony and Mike, this wasn't just the loss of freedom. It was the loss of trust. The loss of everything they thought they had built. Whether guilty or innocent, their names would never be clean again. That's the cruel part of fame. It lifts you high, but when you fall, the whole world watches. And yet people still ask what really happened. Did they do it? Were they victims of something bigger? Or did their pride lead them down the wrong path? The answers may still come out, or maybe we'll never know the full truth. But one thing is certain, the story of Tony and Mike Beets is no longer just about gold. It's about how quickly a legend can turn into a warning. No one saw it coming. Not the fans, not the crew, and maybe not even the Beets family themselves. It started like a whisper, something small that most people didn't take seriously. A news article here, a short online post there. People thought it was just gossip, maybe even a joke. After all, Tony and Mike Beets were famous for digging deep into the ground, not for getting into legal trouble. But then, that whisper turned into a wave. And once the wave started, nothing could stop it. At first, no one even knew what the exact problem was. The headlines were vague. Words like investigation, allegations, and possible charges were being used. Fans asked, what could they have possibly done? These were men who spent their lives working with dirt, machines, and freezing temperatures. They weren't rich CEOs or movie stars living in big cities. They were miners. Tough, simple, and focused. So what kind of crime could pull them into this storm? That question stuck in people's minds. It created curiosity that kept growing. People started watching old episodes of Gold Rush again, trying to find clues. They paid attention to the way Tony talked, how Mike acted, how they handled their crew. Was there anything strange? Anything illegal? Were there signs we had missed all along? Suddenly, every small moment seemed bigger. Every fight on the show, every decision in the mine, every shortcut they took. People looked at everything differently. Soon, more serious reports began to appear. And with those reports came one word that changed everything. Charges. Real, legal charges. Not rumors, not guesses. But something official. It was no longer a small issue or a misunderstanding. Now the law was involved. And once the law gets involved, things get serious fast. Still, no one outside the courtroom knew the full truth. What exactly were they being accused of? What had Tony and Mike done? Some sources said it had something to do with their mining operation. Maybe illegal digging, maybe breaking environmental rules. Others whispered about tax problems or false documents. Some even mentioned unsafe work practices that may have harmed people or the land. The scariest part was that no one knew for sure. But the more people talked, the more the mystery grew. And with mystery comes fear. Imagine being a fan of someone for years, watching them every week, feeling like you know them. Then one day you hear they might be criminals. That feeling is hard to explain. It's like the ground under your feet isn't solid anymore. That's how many fans felt. They were confused, hurt, and shocked. Some defended the Beets. Others said, I always knew something was off. The world began to divide into two sides. Those who believed in their innocence, and those who thought the charges were long overdue. For Tony and Mike, things were even worse. They couldn't speak freely anymore. Every word they said could be used against them. Every move they made was watched. Their faces were no longer just on the TV show. They were in news articles, court documents, and social media debates. People judged them without knowing all the facts. And no matter what they said or did, it was too late to stay in the shadows. They were the center of a storm now. The court didn't move quickly. These kinds of cases take time. There are lawyers, meetings, and documents that seem to never end. But while the legal system moved slowly, the internet moved fast. Stories spread like fire. Some were true, some were half true, and some were just made up. But it didn't matter. The damage had already begun. The Beets name, once a symbol of strength and success, was now tied to scandal. And the worst part, the full truth still hadn't come out. People close to the family started to talk. Old workers, neighbors, even former crew members. Some shared memories that made Tony and Mike look worse. Others said it was all lies and jealousy. But again, who was telling the truth? Who was just trying to get attention? It became harder and harder to know what to believe. Every news story added more confusion. Meanwhile, Discovery Channel remained quiet. The network had made millions from Gold Rush. The Beets family was one of its biggest stars. But now they were in a tricky position. Should they stand by Tony and Mike or cut ties? If they stayed quiet, people would question their support. If they spoke too soon, they could say the wrong thing. So they waited just like everyone else to see what the court would decide. The tension grew stronger every day. Fans were checking news updates like they used to check new episodes. Some people said it felt like a whole new show. Except this time it was real life, and no one knew how it would end. Others couldn't believe it had come to this. How could men who worked so hard, who showed such loyalty to their family and business, now be wearing prison uniforms and leaked court sketches? Still, one thing remained. The question, what exactly had they done? And why? Was it greed? Was it pride? Or was it a simple mistake that got out of control? Everyone wanted answers, but only the courtroom held the truth. The rest of the world could only watch and wait. This part of the story was not about gold or mining anymore. It was about human choices. About how fast life can change. About how even the strongest people can fall if they're not careful. And for Tony and Mike Beets, the fall had just begun. It was the day everyone had been waiting for. The cameras were off, but the attention was more intense than ever. Outside the courtroom, news vans were parked. Reporters stood ready with microphones. Fans stood behind barriers, holding up phones, hoping to catch a glimpse. People were whispering, wondering what would happen today. Inside the building, the atmosphere was heavy. It didn't feel like any normal day. This was the start of something big. The courtroom drama was about to begin. Tony and Mike Beets walked in dressed differently than fans were used to seeing them. No heavy boots, no dirty jackets, no mining gear, just plain, clean clothes. Their faces were serious. There were no smiles, no waves to the crowd. They didn't speak to anyone. All the energy they once showed on the gold fields was gone. They looked tired. Some said they looked scared. And maybe they were. After all, they weren't facing cameras this time. They were facing the law. As they sat down, the room became silent. Every eye was on them. Every breath seemed louder than normal. Then the judge walked in and the case began. This was not like a TV show with dramatic music and fast edits. It was slower, more tense. Every word mattered. Every sentence was part of the story that would decide their future. The lawyers began to speak. The ones accusing Tony and Mike laid out their case. They talked about rules being broken, laws being ignored, and actions that caused damage. They showed papers, pictures, and reports. They used words like evidence, witnesses, and criminal intent. It didn't sound like the Tony and Mike people knew from TV. It sounded like they were talking about strangers. Dangerous ones. But Tony and Mike's lawyers were ready too. They didn't stay quiet. They argued back. They said the Beets were hard-working men, not criminals. They said mistakes might have happened, but they were not done on purpose. They tried to explain how mining is full of challenges, how the rules are sometimes confusing, and how it's easy to get caught in red tape. Their message was clear: don't punish men for doing what they love. The courtroom listened to both sides. Some people nodded, some frowned. It was hard to tell what anyone was really thinking. But one thing was clear: this was not going to be easy. This was not going to end in one day. The case was big. There were many documents, many people involved, and many questions still without answers. The judge listened carefully. His face didn't change much. He asked a few questions, took a lot of notes, and gave strict instructions. No one was allowed to speak out of turn. No one was allowed to take photos. This was not a place for drama. It was a place for truth. Or at least the search for it. Outside the courtroom, the world kept talking. On the internet, new theories started to spread. Some people believed the trial was unfair. They said Tony and Mike were being used as an example, punished more than they deserved just because they were famous. Others believed the opposite. They said if they had broken the law, they should pay the price like anyone else. The arguments were endless. Back inside, the trial continued. Witnesses were called. Some supported Tony and Mike. Others spoke against them. Every new person added a piece to the puzzle. A former worker said safety rules were often ignored at the site. Another said Tony had always tried to do the right thing. Some documents showed illegal digging. Others showed permits that seemed valid. The truth was hiding in the details, and the court was trying to find it. During one part of the trial, something strange happened. Mike was asked a question, and for a moment, he looked emotional. He paused before answering. His voice shook a little. It was a rare moment. The tough miner who always looked strong on TV, now looked human. Vulnerable. That moment stayed with many people in the room. It reminded them that behind the story, behind the fame, were real people with real lives. Tony stayed mostly quiet. He looked straight ahead most of the time. Sometimes he whispered to his lawyer. Sometimes he closed his eyes for a few seconds, like he was thinking hard or praying. His usual tough image was still there, but it was softer now. Like he knew the outcome was out of his hands. Days turned into weeks. The trial felt long. Every day brought something new, but also more confusion. The evidence was not simple. Some parts helped Tony and Mike, others hurt them. People were starting to wonder what the final decision would be. Would the judge believe their story, or would the law come down hard? The Beets family showed up sometimes to support them. Monica, Tony's daughter, sat quietly in the back. She didn't speak, but her presence said a lot. This was not just a legal battle, it was a family crisis. A family that had once been known for strength and unity was now being tested in the worst way. When the trial finally reached the closing stage, everyone leaned in. The lawyers gave their final words. The accusations were strong, the defense was passionate, and then it ended. The courtroom was silent again. The judge said he would take time to think, to review all the details before making a final decision. Tony and Mike stood up, nodded respectfully to the judge, and walked out. Still quiet. Still serious. They didn't know what the final judgment would be. They only knew it was coming soon. And whatever it was, it would change everything. Outside, the crowd had grown. People asked questions. Reporters shouted, but the Beets said nothing. They got into their car and drove away. Their faces were calm, but you could see the weight in their eyes. The courtroom had spoken. And now they had to wait. That wait would feel like a lifetime. The day everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The courtroom was packed again, but this time there was a different kind of tension in the air. The Beets family wasn't just facing rumors anymore. They weren't just fighting accusations. Now they were about to hear their fate. This was no longer a debate. It was the end of a long journey, and the beginning of something even more serious. The judge was about to make his decision. Tony and Mike Beets walked into the courtroom one last time. This time, their faces were even more serious than before. There was no more nervous energy, no more uncertainty. They had been through so many ups and downs during the trial that they seemed almost numb now. They knew this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Everyone in the room could feel it. The gravity of the situation. It was different from before. This wasn't a TV show. This wasn't an episode that could be edited or changed. This was real life. And it was about to change forever. The judge took his seat, and all eyes turned to him. The room was quiet. People waited for the words that would come next. Tony and Mike sat in their chairs, hands clasped in front of them, eyes focused but distant. It was hard to tell what they were thinking. Some people in the room might have been hoping for a miracle, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the judge would find a way to be lenient. After all, these were the Beets. They weren't the typical criminals you'd see in court. They had built their lives from nothing. They had worked hard in the cold Yukon for years. They had a reputation. They were heroes to some, villains to others. But no one could deny that they were known. They were famous, and that fame had brought them here. When the judge finally spoke, the words were blunt and final. Tony Beets. Mike Beets. You are both sentenced to life imprisonment. It was as if time stopped for a moment. The air seemed to get thicker. The room seemed to hold its breath. The judge continued, explaining the reasons for the sentence, but all that could be heard in Tony and Mike's ears was the finality of those words. Life imprisonment. It was a sentence that meant everything: freedom gone, family torn apart, dreams shattered, and it was happening to them. For a moment there was silence. The Beets didn't react immediately. It was as if they couldn't fully process what had just happened. Then slowly they looked at each other. They didn't say anything. They didn't make a scene, but their faces said everything. The shock was there, but so was something else. Something more like resignation. They had fought hard, but now they were losing. And the world was watching. Outside the courtroom, the news spread like wildfire. People were shocked. Fans were in disbelief. How could this happen to Tony and Mike Beets? These were the men who had shown up on TV every week, working in harsh conditions, pulling gold from the earth. They were miners, not criminals. Or at least that's what people thought. The internet went wild with opinions. Some people were angry, saying that the Beets got what they deserved. Others defended them, claiming that the justice system had failed them. It was hard to find anyone who wasn't talking about the case. The Beets were everywhere now. The Beets family was shattered. Their friends, their crew, their loved ones, they all had to deal with the aftermath. The Beets empire was no longer about gold. It was about survival. Tony's daughter Monica, who had always supported her father and brother, was now facing the reality of the situation. No one knew how things would go from here. The Beets were no longer the kings of the Yukon. They were just two men with a sentence hanging over their heads, waiting for whatever would come next. The court decision marked a turning point in their lives. It wasn't just about the time in prison. It was about everything they had worked for. They had lost it all. The respect they had built over years of hard work. The reputation they had earned as miners who could handle anything. The life they had in front of the cameras and behind them. It was all gone. And now Tony and Mike were left to face the consequences of their actions. For those who had followed their story, this was a crushing blow. Fans who had cheered them on, hoping to see them succeed in their quest for gold, now had to watch as their heroes fell. But what happened to their legacy? What would people remember about Tony and Mike Beets? Would they be remembered as strong, hard-working miners who had done their best? Or would they be remembered as criminals, caught in a system that punished them for mistakes they made? There was another question hanging in the air too. Could they appeal the decision? Could they get a lighter sentence? Would they be able to go free again? Those questions were answered in time, but the truth remained that the Beets were facing a long road ahead. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing in life ever is. They would have to come to terms with the reality of their situation. Their empire was no longer about gold. It was about survival. Their future was uncertain, and no one knew what was coming next. The Beets story wasn't just a story of mining anymore. It had become a story of redemption, of finding a way to make it through a difficult time. For Tony and Mike, this was a different kind of challenge. It wasn't about digging for gold. It was about digging deep within themselves to find the strength to face what lay ahead. For the rest of the world, the question still remained. How could men who had worked so hard, who had sacrificed so much, end up here? Was it just the result of a few bad decisions, or was it something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored? The answer might never come, but one thing was certain: the Beets family had changed forever, and the world would never look at them the same way again. The days after the sentencing felt like they were moving in slow motion. The world outside the courtroom had already moved on, but for Tony and Mike Beets, time felt stuck. They had been given a life sentence, a sentence that would change everything about their lives. They no longer had control over what happened next. Their lives, their future, and even their family's future were all now in the hands of a system that didn't care about who they used to be. For the first time in a long while, the Beets had nothing to say. The words that came from the courtroom still echoed in their ears. Life imprisonment. In the days following their sentence, the reality of their situation began to sink in. There was no way to escape what had happened. It wasn't just about the gold they had worked so hard to find. It wasn't just about the TV show or their popularity. It was about their freedom. They had lost it, and now they had to face the consequences. Outside the courtroom, the story became bigger. News stations, social media, and even everyday conversations were filled with talk of the Beets. Some people were angry, blaming them for breaking the law. They said that no one, no matter how famous or tough, should get away with breaking rules. Others stood by them, saying that the Beets were being punished unfairly. They were minors. They had done what they had always done. It wasn't their fault the system failed them. But no matter where you stood, one thing was clear. This was no longer about mining. This was about the collapse of everything the Beets family had built. Monica, Tony's daughter, was one of the people most affected by the sentencing. She had spent years watching her father and brother build something powerful from the ground up. She had seen their hard work, their dedication, and their struggle to make it in one of the toughest industries on earth. But now she was left with a broken family and a future filled with uncertainty. She had to decide how to move forward, how to support her family in a way that they hadn't planned for. She was facing a reality she never imagined. While the world continued to talk, the Beets family was forced to look inward. They had no choice but to come to terms with the sentence and what it meant for them. Tony and Mike had always been known as the strong, unshakable leaders of their crew. They had led their teams through dangerous work, extreme weather, and countless obstacles. They had built an empire on their own terms. But now they were just two men sitting in a courtroom waiting for their lives to be decided by people who didn't know them the way their fans did. The next few weeks were filled with meetings, phone calls, and plans. Tony and Mike were told that there were options. They could appeal the decision, fight for a reduced sentence, or try to make a deal with the authorities. But the more they heard about their options, the more it became clear that there was no easy way out. The legal system was slow, and there was no guarantee that things would get better. The fear of spending the rest of their lives behind bars was real, and it started to sink in that no amount of money or fame could change that. As the days passed, the pressure on the Beets family grew. They had to figure out what to do next. Tony, Mike, and Monica were all struggling to find a way to move forward, knowing that their future was uncertain. The world had watched them succeed. Now they had to deal with watching them fail. The hope that they could turn things around seemed distant. People who had once supported them were starting to turn away, questioning if they had been wrong to defend the Beets in the first place. The internet was full of comments, both angry and sympathetic. It was as if everyone had an opinion on what the Beets had done wrong. Despite the growing public pressure, Tony and Mike kept their heads down. They didn't fight back publicly. They didn't lash out at anyone. Instead, they focused on their family. Their close friends and supporters remained by their side, but the distance between them and the rest of the world had grown. The Beets were no longer the faces of Gold Rush. They were no longer the people who could inspire others with their success. They were simply two men facing the harsh reality of their actions. As time went on, it became clear that the Beets would not easily escape the consequences of their actions. They had tried to explain their side, to show that they weren't criminals. They had argued that they had made mistakes, but that they had worked hard for everything they had. But in the end, the court had decided, and now all that was left was to figure out how to live with it. For Tony and Mike, the hardest part wasn't the time they would spend in prison. It was the fact that they had lost everything they had built. They had lost the respect of many people who had once looked up to them. They had lost their freedom, and in many ways they had lost their identity. The Beets had always been known for their toughness, but now they were facing a kind of challenge that was far beyond anything they had ever prepared for. In the end, the story of the Beets family wasn't just about mining or gold. It was about the price of success, the consequences of actions, and the reality of facing up to mistakes. It was about the fall of two men who had once been at the top of their game, only to see it all slip away. And as the months went by, the question that hung in the air was simple: could they ever rebuild their lives? Could they ever come back from this? The Beets family wasn't done, not yet. They still had time to fight, to make their case, to try to make things right. But it was clear that the journey ahead would be long and painful. And for everyone watching, the only thing left to do was wait. The story of the Beets was far from over, but the next chapter would be the hardest one yet. The months after the sentencing dragged on. Tony and Mike Beets had lost so much, but they weren't ready to give up. The days felt endless, but in the back of their minds there was still a tiny spark of hope. They were trying to accept what had happened, but deep down they knew they couldn't just let it end like this. The sentence had been handed down, but their story wasn't finished yet. The fight for redemption had begun. It wasn't easy. Every day was filled with uncertainty. The Beets had always been strong. They had survived the brutal conditions of the Yukon. They had built something from nothing. But now they were facing something different. They weren't up against weather or rocks. They weren't battling the difficult mining conditions. This was a fight against the law, against the consequences of their own actions, and against the world that once cheered them on. It was a battle that required something more than just physical strength. Tony and Mike began to plan their next steps. Their lawyers told them they had options. There was still a chance for an appeal, but appealing wasn't an easy process. It was slow, it was expensive, and it didn't guarantee anything. Tony and Mike weren't new to challenges. But this was different. They couldn't just dig their way out of this. There were no gold nuggets to find, no hard work that would instantly fix everything. This was going to take time, and it was going to take every ounce of their strength. The Beets family, especially Monica, felt the weight of the situation. She was watching her father and brother struggle, and she knew that they needed her now more than ever. But Monica wasn't just dealing with the pain of seeing her family in trouble. She was also facing the world's judgment. Fans who had once loved the Beets now had questions. They were divided, some still supporting the Beets, and others turning their backs on them. The internet was filled with mixed reactions. Some people believed the Beets had made a mistake but deserved another chance. Others thought they had gotten what they deserved and weren't worth defending anymore. It wasn't just about public opinion. The Beets were facing real consequences. They had lost their gold mining empire. They had lost their place on the show that had made them famous. They had lost their freedom, and now they had to figure out how to rebuild. They didn't know how long it would take, but they knew they couldn't just sit around. They couldn't let this be the end of their story. In the first few weeks after the sentence, Tony and Mike kept to themselves. They didn't want to talk to the media. They didn't want to make any public statements. They wanted to focus on their legal strategy and figure out what they could do next. But as time went on, the pressure grew. The Beets were famous, and the world was still watching. The trial had been a huge story, and now people were waiting to see what would happen next. Would they fight back? Would they give up? Or would they find a way to change their fate? Behind closed doors, Tony and Mike were working on their next move. They were meeting with their lawyers, going over the case, and figuring out what went wrong. They were looking for any reason to appeal the decision. They wanted to prove that they weren't bad people. They weren't criminals. They had made mistakes, yes, but they had worked hard to create a life for themselves. They had fought every step of the way, and they weren't ready to let everything slip away. Meanwhile, Monica was becoming more involved in the process. She wasn't just standing on the sidelines anymore. She was learning about the legal system, trying to understand the case better, and finding ways to help her family. She knew that their journey was going to be long, but she also knew that they weren't alone. They had each other, and together they could find a way out of this. The road to redemption wasn't going to be easy. The Beets had lost a lot, but they still had a chance to fight for something better. They weren't sure what that something would look like, but they were determined to get there. They had been through so much already. They had faced storms, rough terrain, and dangerous situations. But this was different. This was not about physical strength. This was about the mental and emotional strength to keep going. As they started their legal fight, something began to change. Slowly but surely, they were able to rebuild their relationship with their fans. It wasn't an instant change. Some people still questioned whether the Beets deserved a second chance, but as the days passed, more and more people started to believe in their fight. They saw the Beets not as criminals, but as people who were trying to make things right. Fans who had once turned away began to support them again. They saw the Beets as real people, not just characters on a TV show. But not everyone was convinced. Some people believed that Tony and Mike had gotten off too easily. They thought that a life sentence wasn't enough, and that the Beets should pay a higher price for their actions. There were heated debates online and in the news, but for the Beets it didn't matter. They knew that they couldn't control what the world thought of them. All they could do was focus on their family, and fight for their future. Over time, the Beets started to see some progress. Their legal team was working hard, and there were signs that things might improve. The appeal was moving forward, and they were starting to get more positive attention. It was still a long shot, but it was a chance, and for Tony and Mike that was enough to keep fighting. The fight for redemption was far from over, but as long as they had each other, they knew they could keep pushing forward. The Beets story was no longer just about gold or fame. It was about resilience, about fighting for a second chance, and about the power of family. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: they weren't going to give up without a fight. They had lost a lot, but they hadn't lost everything. And as long as they had hope, they would keep moving forward. The road to redemption was long, but the Beets were ready to walk it. They were ready to prove that they were more than just their mistakes, and that they could rise again.